if you came to me and said, "Okay, I'm only ever going to read 10 books for the rest of my life. What should I read?" Welcome to Book Labyrinth, where we unravel the stories behind the pages. Honestly, I think this would be one of the hardest questions you could ask me, because there are so many books out there that I believe people should experience at least once. And the more you read, the harder it becomes to narrow that list down. But if I really had to choose just 10, these are the books I would give you. And I didn't want this list to be 10 books from one particular genre. I wanted it to have a little bit of everything: literary fiction, classics, poetry, contemporary fiction, fantasy, memoir, and books that make you look at ordinary life in a completely different way. More importantly, these are books that I genuinely think can give you something, even if you don't normally read this kind of book. So if you're only going to read 10 books in your lifetime, babe, I really think you should start here. And of course, if you've read any of these, tell me what you thought. And if there is a book that you genuinely believe everyone should read at least once, please tell me, because I'm always looking for the next book to add to my list. So let's get into it. First up, we have a book that I was intimidated by for the longest time, and that is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. If you know anything about this book, you probably already know that it is enormous, and that was exactly what scared me away from it for so long. But when I finally picked it up, I realized that the length was almost part of the experience. We follow Theo Decker, who is 13 years old when a catastrophe at a museum completely changes the course of his life. His mother dies, and Theo is left trying to figure out how to continue living in a world that suddenly feels completely unfamiliar. And this book really becomes a story about grief, guilt, love, obsession, and the strange ways that people try to survive after something irreversible happens to them. What I love most about The Goldfinch is that it doesn't make grief feel simple. Theo makes decisions that you might understand, decisions that you might hate, and decisions that you might not know how to feel about at all. But that's what makes him feel so human. It's heartbreaking, messy, incredibly immersive, and somehow manages to make you care about this person's entire life. And yes, it is a long book. But if you're going to read it, I really think you should take your time with it. It is one of those books that you don't simply finish. You live with it for a while. Next, we have a book that I think is particularly interesting if you spend any amount of time online, and that is Tomorrow, and Tomorrow, and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. At first glance, you might think this is simply a book about two people who make video games together. But it becomes so much more than that. Sam and Sadie meet when they are young, and their shared love of games eventually brings them together to create something of their own. And what follows is a story about friendship, ambition, creativity, jealousy, success, failure, love, and all of the complicated things that happen when the person who understands your creative mind best is also someone you can't quite figure out how to love properly. I think one of the reasons this book stayed with me is because it understands that relationships don't always fit neatly into categories. Sometimes someone can be the most important person in your life without being your romantic partner. Sometimes you can love somebody deeply and still hurt each other. And sometimes creating something beautiful with another person doesn't mean you get a beautiful relationship with them. It's emotional without feeling like it is trying too hard to make you cry. And if you've ever had a friendship that shaped who you became, I think there is a really good chance something in this book will hit you. Up next, we have a poetry collection that I genuinely believe even people who don't think they like poetry should try, and that is Devotions by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver has this extraordinary ability to take something incredibly ordinary, a bird, a tree, a field, a walk, the ocean, and make you stop and actually look at it. Her poetry is deeply connected to nature, but I don't think it's really just about nature. It's about paying attention. It's about being alive enough to notice the world around you. And I think that's something that most of us have become incredibly bad at. We're constantly looking at our phones, thinking about what happened yesterday, worrying about tomorrow, trying to become the next version of ourselves. And then you read Mary Oliver, and suddenly you're thinking about sunlight on grass. I also think this is one of the most accessible poetry collections you could start with if poetry intimidates you. You don't have to sit down and analyze every line. You can simply read a poem, sit with it, and let it make you feel something. There is something incredibly comforting about her work. And honestly, I think the world would be a slightly happier place if more people spent a little more time reading Mary Oliver. Now we have my personal favorite book on this entire list, and that is Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. I will admit, this is probably one of the more difficult recommendations because Clarice Lispector's writing is very particular. It is introspective. It is philosophical. It moves through thoughts and feelings in a way that can sometimes feel almost dreamlike. But I absolutely love it. The novel follows Joanna, a young woman trying to understand herself, her relationships, her desires, and what exactly she wants from her life. And I think this book is especially powerful if you're young and still trying to figure out who you're supposed to become. It asks questions about morality, identity, love, loneliness, mortality, and whether it is actually possible to live a life that feels completely true to yourself. There were so many moments where I stopped reading because I had to sit there and think about what I'd just read. And that is one of my favorite experiences a book can give you. Not just entertainment. Recognition. That feeling of someone putting a thought into words that you have somehow been carrying around inside yourself for years. If you're in your 20s especially, I would absolutely give this one a try. Next is a very different kind of reading experience, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And honestly, I would recommend knowing as little as possible before you read this. So I'll keep the premise very simple. We follow a man named Piranesi who lives inside an enormous, mysterious house filled with statues, endless halls, staircases, tides, and a strange sense that something about his world isn't quite right. That's basically all you need to know. Because the experience of slowly discovering what is actually happening is part of the reason this book is so special. But underneath all of the mystery and fantasy, I think Piranesi is really a book about loneliness, memory, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about the world we live in. It is strange in the best possible way. It is atmospheric. It is beautiful. And there is something almost meditative about reading it. It's also quite short, which makes it one of those books that you can pick up without feeling like you've committed yourself to a 600-page emotional journey. And when you finish it, I genuinely think you'll want to go back and think about the entire story from the beginning. Next, we have Beartown by Fredrik Backman. And if you've never read Fredrik Backman before, I really think you should. Beartown takes place in a small town where ice hockey is basically the center of everyone's world. The town's future seems to depend on the success of its young hockey team, and everyone has an opinion about the players, their parents, the coaches, the teachers, and what happens next. And because of that, there isn't really one single protagonist. You get this enormous cast of people, and somehow Backman makes almost every single one of them feel real. But beneath the hockey story, this book is really about community. It's about loyalty. It's about what happens when protecting one person means hurting another. It's about the stories communities tell themselves in order to protect their own identity. And it gets heavy. There are absolutely topics in this book that deserve a content warning, so I would recommend checking those beforehand. But what makes Beartown so powerful is the nuance. Nobody feels completely simple. Nobody is just good or evil. They're people. And that is exactly what Backman does so well. He makes you care about people even when you don't agree with them. Now, let's talk about a book that completely changed the way I think about ordinary life. The Anthropocene, reviewed by John Green. This is technically a collection of essays, but it often feels like something much more personal than that. John Green takes ordinary things from the modern world, sometimes something meaningful, sometimes something completely ridiculous, and reviews them on a 5-star scale. But the actual rating isn't really the point. The point is what happens when you spend enough time thinking about something that you normally wouldn't think twice about. And somehow, these essays move between humor, history, science, anxiety, love, loneliness, and what it means to be a person living in this very strange period of human history. I think that's why I love this book. It makes the ordinary feel important. And sometimes I think that's exactly what we need from books. Not another productivity system. Not another 5-step plan to fix our lives. Just someone reminding us that being alive is already a pretty strange and beautiful thing. Speaking of books that make you see ordinary life differently, we have The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is a memoir about grief, written after Didion lost her husband suddenly. And it is one of the most honest books I've ever encountered about what grief actually feels like. Not the inspirational version, not the version where everything eventually becomes okay. The confusing version. The irrational version. The version where your mind understands something has happened, but some part of you still expects the person to walk through the door. I think grief can feel incredibly isolating because everybody experiences it differently. But books like this remind you that even when your grief is uniquely yours, you are not the first person to experience this kind of pain. And sometimes having somebody put that experience into words can make you feel a little less alone. I think this is one of those books that you might read differently at different points in your life. And I can imagine returning to it again and again. Next, we have Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. This is one of those books where I really don't want to tell you too much about the plot. We follow Cyrus, a young man who has recently lost both of his parents and is struggling with grief, identity, addiction, faith, and the question of what exactly makes a life meaningful. He becomes fascinated by the idea of martyrdom and begins thinking deeply about death, sacrifice, and whether a person's life can mean something beyond simply existing. And then he unexpectedly meets someone who changes the direction of his thinking. That is honestly enough to know, because the beauty of this book isn't just the premise. It's the writing. It's the questions it leaves you with. What do we owe the people we've lost? What makes a life meaningful? And how much of who we are is created by the people we love? It can be heavy, absolutely, but it is also incredibly beautiful. And finally, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I wanted to end with a classic because I think there are certain books that remain relevant no matter how much time passes. And this is definitely one of them. The premise is iconic. Dorian Gray is a beautiful young man who becomes obsessed with preserving his youth and beauty, while a portrait of him begins to reflect the consequences of the life he is living. But underneath that almost Gothic premise is a fascinating exploration of vanity, morality, pleasure, youth, corruption, and the way we construct our identities. And what makes it especially interesting today is how easily you can connect it to the culture we live in now. We're constantly surrounded by images of perfect lives, perfect bodies, perfect faces, perfect versions of ourselves. We're taught to preserve youth, build an image, and present a version of ourselves that other people will admire. And Dorian Gray takes that obsession and pushes it to an extreme. It's dark, witty, philosophical, and surprisingly funny in places. And if you've avoided classics because you assume they're going to feel boring or inaccessible, I really think this is one to try. So, those are the 10 books that I genuinely think everyone should read at least once in their lifetime. Not because they're objectively the 10 greatest books ever written. I don't think a list like that can really exist. But because each of these books gives you something different. Some will break your heart. Some will make you question your identity. Some will make you look at nature differently. Some will make you think about grief. Some will make you think about friendship, morality, memory, beauty, or simply what it means to be alive. And maybe that's what I want from a lifetime of reading. Not to remember every plot, not to finish the most books, but to occasionally find a book that changes the way I see something I thought I already understood. So, if you could only choose 10 books to read for the rest of your life, which ones would you choose? And if there's one book you believe absolutely everyone should read at least once, tell me in the comments, because I can almost guarantee that whatever you recommend is going straight onto my TBR. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for being here, and I really hope you found at least one book on this list that you want to pick up. I'll see you in the next one.